The Abyss is often remembered as one of the most ambitious sci-fi films ever made. But what truly made the movie legendary was the fact that many of its impossible-looking underwater scenes were created years before modern CGI even existed properly. Director James Cameron wanted the audience to feel like they were actually trapped deep inside the ocean, surrounded by unknown life forms and terrifying pressure. And to achieve that realism, the filmmakers combined groundbreaking CGI, massive underwater sets, practical effects, miniatures, and real underwater shooting techniques that pushed Hollywood technology to its limits. What's even crazier is that many of the techniques invented for this film later became the foundation for movies like Terminator 2: Judgment Day and modern CGI filming itself. And honestly, some scenes from The Abyss still look impressive even today. One of the most unforgettable moments in The Abyss comes when a mysterious transparent water tentacle suddenly enters the deep core underwater station. At first, the crew believes it's just a strange water leak, but slowly the liquid starts taking shape. Within seconds, the tentacle begins perfectly mimicking the crew members' faces, their eyes, expressions, and even subtle movements. For audiences in 1989, this moment felt completely unreal because nobody had ever seen CGI behave this naturally before. Even today, it's hard to believe that this effect was created in the late 80s. But the behind-the-scenes process was even more revolutionary. Initially, James Cameron wanted to create the creature using practical effects, like stop-motion animation and rubber models. However, the biggest problem was realism. Water simply didn't move naturally enough with those techniques. That's when Cameron brought in industrial light and magic, and this single decision ended up changing CGI history forever. For this sequence, ILM had to invent entirely new CGI tools and software because realistic liquid simulation technology barely existed at the time. First, the deep core station sets were photographed and digitally mapped from every possible angle, so the computer-generated water creature could move naturally through the real environment. In many ways, this became an early version of the motion tracking technology used in modern filmmaking today. The artists also developed a special reflective surface system that calculated how water should react to light underwater. Internally, the crew jokingly called the creature the water weenie, but the most difficult part was face mimicry. Actors Ed Harris and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio had their facial expressions digitally scanned and converted into primitive 3D models. Those expressions were then morphed directly onto the animated water surface. And remember, this was 1989, when face morphing technology was still experimental. In fact, the research and techniques developed here later became the foundation for the liquid metal T-1000 effects in Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Interestingly, not every shot was fully CGI. When Lindsay touches the water tentacle with her finger, filmmakers combined real practical interaction with digital compositing. First, the actors were filmed normally on the practical set. Then, the camera movement was digitally tracked, and the CGI water creature was animated afterward to match the environment perfectly. Finally, optical compositing and digital rendering were blended together to create the final effect. What's truly shocking is that the film contains only around 75 seconds of CGI water animation, yet completing those shots took nearly 6 months of work, and when the movie finally released, audiences genuinely couldn't believe what they were seeing. This single sequence became one of the most important milestones in Hollywood's CGI history. Towards the climax of The Abyss, we finally encounter the mysterious glowing alien beings known as the NTIs. Unlike traditional scary movie aliens, these creatures appear peaceful, elegant, and almost magical as they silently move through the dark underwater world. Their glowing bodies and smooth movement make them feel less like monsters and more like intelligent life forms naturally evolved beneath the ocean. Director James Cameron actually took inspiration from real deep-sea organisms while designing them. In the deepest parts of Earth's oceans, many real creatures are naturally bioluminescent, meaning they produce their own light. Cameron used this concept to give the NTIs their soft glowing appearance, making them feel scientifically believable instead of purely fantasy-based. To create these aliens on screen, filmmakers used a hybrid combination of practical effects and optical techniques. For close-up shots, miniature alien models and puppets were physically built. Inside their transparent bodies, the crew installed tiny lights and fiber optics so they could glow naturally underwater. When filmed in water, the reflections and floating movement made the creatures appear surprisingly lifelike. The underwater cinematography itself also played a huge role. Cinematographer Mikhail Salomon used soft blue lighting, diffusion filters, and underwater reflections to create a dreamy and mysterious atmosphere. Some wider shots combine miniature photography with animated light effects using optical compositing techniques. Since fully CGI creatures weren't realistically possible yet in 1989, the filmmakers relied on a smart blend of miniatures, puppetry, lighting tricks, and compositing. And honestly, that practical approach is probably why these glowing aliens still look believable decades later, because instead of depending entirely on computers, the film used real physical elements interacting naturally with water and light. One of the craziest things about The Abyss is that James Cameron didn't try to fake the underwater world with simple blue screens or camera tricks. Instead, he literally created a real underwater filmmaking environment. The deep core drilling station shown in the movie was built inside an abandoned nuclear power plant in South Carolina, where production crews transformed two gigantic, unfinished reactor tanks into massive underwater studios. These tanks were filled with millions of gallons of water, and inside them, the team constructed a full-scale, deep-core set, complete with control rooms, corridors, doors, machinery, and living quarters. Almost everything the actors touched on screen was physically real, but the most insane part was that these sets were permanently submerged underwater. That means the actors weren't standing on a dry soundstage pretending to float, they were actually underwater during filming. Every scene became physically exhausting because the cast had to work in real diving conditions for hours. The environment itself felt dangerous and unpredictable, which is exactly why the tension in the film feels so authentic even today. Lighting the set became another massive challenge. Since the tanks were outdoors, sunlight would naturally enter the water and ruin the illusion of deep ocean darkness. Cameron wanted the station to feel isolated and eerie, like it was sitting thousands of feet below the sea. So the production team stretched an enormous black tarp over the entire tank to block out sunlight completely. Once the underwater lights were turned on, the deep core station suddenly looked like a real alien underwater base hidden in the darkness of the ocean. That obsessive level of realism is one of the biggest reasons The Abyss still looks believable decades later. The underwater exploration scenes in The Abyss feel incredibly real because James Cameron refused to use the usual Hollywood tricks of the 1980s. At that time, most underwater scenes in movies were faked, using wires, smoke, slow motion, or dry sets, but Cameron wanted audiences to feel the real weightlessness, pressure, and struggle of being underwater. Because of that, most of the exploration sequences were filmed for real inside giant water tanks. To prepare for this, the actors had to go through actual diving training. They weren't just memorizing dialogue, they had to learn how to move like professional divers, communicate underwater, maintain balance, and control their breathing. Communication underwater was another nightmare. Nobody could simply yell action or cut beneath the surface. Instead, Cameron and his crew used underwater lights and hand signals to direct the actors. Imagine the situation: freezing water, giant underwater cameras moving around, actors struggling in heavy suits, and safety divers swimming everywhere around them. The entire production felt less like a movie set and more like a real deep-sea mission, and honestly, that realism is exactly what separates The Abyss from other sci-fi films of its era. When audiences watch Bud and the crew struggling underwater, it doesn't feel like actors pretending to dive because they were genuinely struggling underwater in real conditions. One of the most futuristic parts of The Abyss was its mini submarines and underwater vehicles, which made the movie feel years ahead of its time. But surprisingly, these sequences weren't created using just one technique. James Cameron combined full-size practical vehicles, miniature models, and underwater cinematography to create the illusion of massive deep-sea machinery. For close-up scenes, the production built real full-size mini-submersibles that could actually move underwater inside the tanks. Anchors sat inside these practical vehicles while cameras captured real reflections, lighting, and underwater movement naturally. Because the submarines were physically in the water, every vibration, bubble, and light reflection looked completely authentic. So, if you enjoyed discovering these insane behind-the-scenes secrets, then make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which movies BTS should we explore next.